On February 19, 1943, American soldiers huddled in foxholes along a narrow mountain pass in central Tunisia. They were young men, most of them barely out of high school. Many had never fired their weapons in anger. They were about to face the German Afrika Korps for the first time, battle-hardened veterans who had been fighting in the desert for 2 years. And 70 miles behind them, their commanding general sat in an underground bunker he had ordered engineers to blast into solid rock. Major General Lloyd Fredendall had never visited the front lines. He communicated in a private code his own staff could barely understand. He had spent 3 weeks directing 200 engineers to build his personal fortress while his soldiers dug foxholes with entrenching tools. He was about to preside over the worst defeat in United States Army history. 5 weeks later, that same general returned home to a hero's welcome. Newspapers printed favorable stories about his service. He received a promotion to 3-star general. He spent the rest of the war training troops and, according to one account, giving away brides at weddings of officers under his command. He retired with full honors and died in 1963, buried with military ceremony at Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery in San Diego. This is the story of Lloyd Fredendall, the Battle of Kasserine Pass, and the strange logic that turned America's greatest military failure into something the Army considered a success. The answer reveals how the United States military handled defeat in ways fundamentally different from its enemies, and why that difference may have helped win the war. Lloyd Ralston Fredendall was born on December 28, 1883, at Fort D. Russell in Wyoming Territory. His father, Ira Fredendall, was an active-duty soldier who later became sheriff of Laramie County, serving from 1893 to 1996. The military was in his blood, and young Lloyd seemed destined for a career in uniform. His path to generalship began with failure. Admitted to West Point through the patronage of Senator Francis Warren, one of the most powerful politicians in Wyoming, Fredendall was dismissed after 1 semester for poor performance in mathematics and general department. A classmate later described him as a very soldierly little fellow, but extremely goaty in mathematics. The word goaty was West Point slang for deficient, for failing to meet the Academy's standards. His mother, described by historians as domineering, refused to accept her son's failure. She persuaded Senator Warren to reappoint him. Fredendall tried again, but could not complete the program. When Warren offered a 3rd nomination, West Point refused to readmit him. The young man who dreamed of leading soldiers had been rejected by the institution that produced America's military elite. Most men would have abandoned their military ambitions. Fredendall found another way. In 1906, he took the Army's officer qualifying examination, a test that allowed civilians to earn commissions without attending West Point. He scored first among 70 applicants. He received his commission as a 2nd lieutenant on February 13, 1907, without ever graduating from the military academy. It was an achievement that demonstrated both his determination and his ability to succeed through unconventional paths. His career that followed was distinguished on paper. He deployed to France in 1917 when the United States entered the First World War, but he spent the entire conflict as an instructor at army schools. He never saw combat. He never heard a shot fired in anger. He never experienced the chaos and terror that defined the Western Front. While other officers learned the brutal realities of modern warfare in the trenches, Fredendall perfected the art of training and administration. He excelled in these roles. He graduated as a distinguished student from the Command and General Staff School at Fort Leavenworth in 1923, placing 31st of 151 officers. He completed the Army War College. He commanded increasingly important units during the interwar years. By 1940, he had risen to Major General commanding the 4th Infantry Division. His efficiency reports glowed with praise. His superiors saw a capable administrator, an articulate briefer, a man who knew how to navigate the peacetime Army's bureaucracy. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall was especially fond of the youthful-looking, cocky Fredendall. Marshall described him as one of the best and reportedly remarked at a staff meeting that he liked that man because you could see determination all over his face. Marshall had a talent for identifying officers who could rise to the demands of combat. He had selected Eisenhower for high command. He had promoted George Patton. His judgment shaped the Army's leadership for the entire war. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, commander of Army Ground Forces and the man responsible for training the massive citizen army that would fight in Europe and the Pacific, shared Marshall's confidence in Fredendall. McNair included him on a list of the top 3 generals he believed capable of commanding all American forces being sent to Britain. This was extraordinary praise. It placed Fredendall among the most trusted senior officers in the entire United States Army. When planning Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa scheduled for November 1942, Marshall urged Fredendall on a skeptical Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower had doubts. He had worked with Fredendall and found him difficult.
But Marshall was the Chief of Staff, and Eisenhower deferred to his judgment. Fredendall would command the Center Task Force responsible for capturing Oran in Algeria. The Oran landing went reasonably well. French resistance was lighter than expected, and the city fell within days. In November 1942, Eisenhower cabled Marshall with enthusiasm. "I bless the day you urged Fredendall upon me," he wrote, and cheerfully acknowledged that my earlier doubts of him were completely unfounded. It seemed that Marshall's faith had been justified, but the warning signs were already visible to those who looked closely. General Lucian Truscott, who would later command corps and armies with distinction, observed Fredendall carefully. He recalled him as small in stature, loud and rough in speech, outspoken in his opinions, and critical of superiors and subordinates alike. Fredendall had a gift for making enemies. He alienated the officers who should have been his closest collaborators. He was known as an Anglophobe who despised the British, and a Franophobe who looked down on the French. This was an unfortunate combination of prejudice, given that the Tunisian campaign was fought in cooperation with British and Free French forces. Coalition warfare requires tact, diplomacy, and the ability to work with allies whose methods and priorities differ from your own. Fredendall possessed none of these qualities. But Marshall's confidence carried weight. Fredendall took command of the Second Corps, the primary American ground force in Tunisia, and prepared his men to face Erwin Rommel's Afrika Corps. The Desert Fox had been fighting in North Africa since February 1941. His soldiers had defeated the British repeatedly. They knew the terrain, the tactics, and the brutal realities of desert warfare. The Americans knew almost nothing. The disaster unfolded across 10 days in February 1943, beginning with the German offensive at Sidi Bouzid on Valentine's Day and culminating in the Battle for Kasserine Pass itself. It was the first time American ground forces had faced the Wehrmacht in significant numbers, and the results were catastrophic. At 4 in the morning on February 14th, under cover of a sandstorm that reduced visibility to a few hundred yards, 140 German tanks from the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions attacked through Faid and Mesilla passes. 4 battle groups executed a classic pincer movement, the kind of maneuver that Rommel had perfected over 2 years of desert fighting. Instead of attacking American infantry positions directly, the Germans bypassed the defenders on Jebel Lasouda and Jebel Kasira, isolating them from reinforcement and supply. The 2,000 officers and men of the 34th Infantry Division's 168th Infantry Regiment found themselves surrounded. They were National Guard soldiers from Iowa, men who had trained together for years before the war. Now they huddled in foxholes on rocky hilltops, watching German tanks roll past them toward objectives in their rear. They had been abandoned, cut off, left to fend for themselves. They held out for 3 days, hoping for relief that never came. Ultimately, only 300 managed to evade capture by slipping through German lines at night and walking across the desert to American positions. The rest, some 1,700 men, marched into German prisoner-of-war camps, where many would remain until the war's end more than 2 years later. American tanks were caught by surprise. On that first morning, some crews were cooking breakfast when the Germans struck. They scrambled to start their engines, to load ammunition, to form some kind of defensive line. But the Germans had positioned their fearsome 88mm guns, originally designed as anti-aircraft weapons, but devastating against tanks, on the high ground, overlooking the American positions. These guns outranged American tank weapons by hundreds of yards. They destroyed Shermans before the American crews could close to effective firing distance. The ambush was methodical and merciless. On February 15th, Combat Command C of the 1st Armored Division counterattacked. This was standard doctrine. When the enemy penetrates your lines, you counterattack to restore the position. But the counterattack drove directly into a German anti-tank trap. The Germans had anticipated exactly this response and positioned their guns accordingly. The result was catastrophic. 46 medium tanks and 9 self-propelled guns were destroyed in a single engagement. American tank crews died in burning vehicles, unable to escape before the ammunition cooked off. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Hightower's tank was hit during the counterattack at Sidi Bouzid. The inside of the tank immediately caught fire. Hightower ordered his crew to bail out and escaped on foot, walking miles across the desert to reach American lines. His battalion lost 44 of 51 tanks in a single day. Behind him, the wreckage smoldered in the African sun. By February 17th, Field Marshal Rommel assessed Phase 1 as complete. The Americans had been driven back with heavy losses. Their counterattacks had failed. Their defensive positions had been overrun or bypassed. Now he prepared for the decisive blow, a thrust through Kasserine Pass that would sever Allied supply lines and potentially drive the Americans from Tunisia entirely. Fredendall ordered withdrawal from Spitla and Feriana, the towns that had anchored the American defensive line. At this point, 2nd Corps had already suffered 2,500 men lost, 103 tanks destroyed, 280 vehicles wrecked, and 18 field guns captured. The retreat was chaotic. Units became separated, equipment was abandoned, soldiers streamed westward without clear orders or destinations. American forces fell back to Kasserine Pass in the western dorsal mountains. The pass itself was a 2-mile-wide gap in the mountains, a natural choke point that controlled access to the vital supply base at Tebessa and the road network that supported Allied operations in Tunisia. If the Germans broke through the pass, they could roll up the entire Allied position in central Tunisia. Everything depended on holding this ground. On February 19th, the Afrika Corps Assault Group attacked. American defenders under Colonel Alexander Stark, commander of the 26th Regimental Combat Team, held the pass with a hastily assembled force of infantry, artillery, and engineers. General Fredendall had telephoned Stark the previous evening with dramatic instructions. "I want you to go to Kasserine right away and pull a Stonewall Jackson," he said. The command was officially designated Stark Force at night. Stark's men fought with desperate courage, knowing that the entire front depended on them, but they were outnumbered and outgunned, facing veteran German troops supported by tanks and artillery. On February 20th, German Panzer Grenadiers and Italian Bersagliers overran the mountain shoulders overlooking the pass. These heights commanded the valley floor. Once the Germans held them, the defenders in the pass itself were exposed to fire from above.
By evening, Axis forces controlled the exits towards both Thalla to the north and Tebessa to the west. The gateway was open. The supply base lay just 30 miles away. Then the tide began to turn, not through Fredendall's leadership, but despite it. On February 21st and 22nd, the United States 16th Infantry Regiment and Combat Command B halted the German advance at Jebel al-Hamra. These units had not been shattered in the initial attacks. Their officers led from the front. Their soldiers held their ground. Critically, artillery reinforcements arrived at the last possible moment. 48 guns of the 9th Infantry Division's artillery reached the battle after a punishing forced march of 777 miles from western Algeria, covered in 3 days and 12 hours by 411 vehicles carrying over 2,000 men. 12 155mm howitzers, 24 105mm howitzers, and 12 75mm howitzers under Brigadier General Stafford Loy Erwin joined 36 British guns already at Thalla. The combined Allied artillery now totaled 84 pieces.
On the morning of February 22, this masked artillery fired devastating barrages into the 10th Panzer Division's attack. German tanks that had rolled forward expecting light resistance ran into a wall of exploding shells. Infantry following the armor was caught in the open and cut down. The attack stalled, then stopped, then began to fall back. At 14:15 hours, Rommel made his decision. The offensive had failed. The element of surprise was gone. Allied reinforcements were arriving faster than he could advance. His supply lines were stretched thin. He ordered withdrawal. By February 24, Allied forces reoccupied Kasserine Pass. The battle was over. The final toll was devastating. Approximately 300 Americans killed, 3,000 wounded, and 3,000 missing or captured. Roughly 6,500 total casualties in 10 days of fighting. Equipment losses included 183 tanks, 104 half-tracks, 208 artillery pieces, and 512 trucks and other vehicles. The material losses alone represented months of industrial production shipped across the Atlantic at great risk from German submarines. German casualties were remarkably light by comparison. 201 killed, 536 wounded, 252 missing, 989 total. Only 20 tanks lost. The exchange ratio was catastrophic for the Americans. They had lost nearly 7 men for every German casualty. Omar Gradley later reflected on the disaster in his memoirs. Even these many years later, it pains me to reflect on that disaster, he wrote. It was probably the worst performance of United States Army troops in their whole proud history. While his soldiers fought and died at the front, where had Lloyd Fredendall been? He directed operations from a location soldiers called Speedy Valley, a ravine 9 miles southeast of Tebessa, 70 miles behind the battle. There, he had ordered an entire engineer company from the 19th Engineer Regiment to blast 2 U-shaped tunnel complexes into solid rock. Each complex ran 160 feet into the hillside, with parallel shafts 6.5 feet high and 5 feet wide. An anti-aircraft battalion ringed the headquarters for protection against enemy air attack. 200 engineers worked for more than 3 weeks on this project, using equipment and explosives that could have constructed defensive positions for the soldiers actually facing the enemy. They eventually abandoned the tunnels unfinished when the front collapsed and 2nd Corps had to retreat. But the resources consumed in building Fredendall's personal bunker represented a fundamental misallocation of priorities that shocked every officer who saw it. The troops had their own names for the command post. They called it Lloyd's Very Last Resort. They called it Shangri-La, a million miles from nowhere. The bitter humor reflected their understanding that their commanding general cared more about his own safety than theirs. When Bradley first saw the bunker during his inspection tour, he called it an embarrassment to every American soldier.
Eisenhower was equally disturbed. He later reminded his senior commanders that even generals must assume personal risk in combat. The message was clear, though Fredendall's name was never mentioned directly. Leaders who hide while their soldiers die forfeit their right to command. Fredendall's concern for his own safety extended beyond the bunker. He repeatedly phoned Iran to demand faster delivery of a bulletproof Cadillac, similar to the one Eisenhower used. While soldiers at the front lacked ammunition and fuel, their commanding general worried about armored transportation for himself. He never visited the front lines during the entire battle. He directed troop dispositions from map readings alone, without ever seeing the terrain his men would have to defend. He did not know that the positions he ordered them to hold were exposed to enemy observation. He did not know that the roads he expected them to use for retreat were impossible. He did not know any of this because he never bothered to look. His orders compounded the problem. Despite being a distinguished graduate of the Command and General Staff School, which taught standardized procedures to ensure clarity in combat communications, Fredendall invented his own incomprehensible terminology. Infantry became walking boys. Artillery became pop guns. Specific units received code names that bore no relation to their actual designations.
A typical order reads something like this: move your command, that is the walking boys, pop guns, Baker's outfit, and the outfit which is the reverse of Baker's outfit, and the big fellows, to M, which is due north of where you are now, as soon as possible. Work on your own transportation. Brigadier General Paul Robinett, one of Fredendall's subordinate commanders, observed that deciphering Fredendall's messages took him as long as it would take any German monitoring the radio. The code provided no security whatsoever. The Germans could not understand it, but neither could the Americans who received it. It only created confusion among officers trying to coordinate their defense against an enemy that attacked with clarity and precision. When Colonel Thomas Drake radioed from Sidi Bouzid requesting permission to retreat as German tanks surrounded his position, Fredendall refused. He was 70 miles away, staring at a map that could not convey the desperation of Drake's situation. "Hold your position," he ordered. "Reinforcements are coming." The reinforcements never arrived. Fredendall had promised tanks that were already committed elsewhere. He had promised artillery support that could not reach Drake's position. He had promised air cover that never appeared. Nearly 1,400 men were captured because their commanding general could not grasp what was happening and would not delegate authority to officers who could. Fredendall's relationships with his subordinates ranged from toxic to non-existent. Major General Orlando Ward of the 1st Armored Division repeatedly protested Fredendall's practice of splitting his armor into penny packets scattered across a 30-mile front. This violated everything the Army had learned about tank warfare. Armored doctrine emphasized keeping tank units masked for concentrated striking power. Scattered in small groups across wide fronts, tanks could not support each other when attacked. They could be defeated in detail by an enemy who concentrated his forces. Fredendall ignored Ward's protests. He had his own ideas about how to use tanks, ideas that contradicted established doctrine and common sense. When Ward continued to object, Fredendall retaliated by excluding him from operational meetings. The two generals were barely on speaking terms by the time the Germans attacked. The commanding general and his armor commander could not coordinate because they could not communicate. Major General Terry DeLawsome Allen of the 1st Infantry Division clashed similarly with Fredendall over the dispersal of his regiments across terrain they could not possibly defend. Allen was a fighter, a hard-drinking, profane combat leader who understood that soldiers needed aggressive leadership. Fredendall was his opposite, a staff officer playing at generalship from the safety of his underground bunker. The two men despised each other. British Lieutenant General Kenneth Anderson, whose 1st Army included Fredendall's 2nd Corps in its order of battle, considered Fredendall incompetent well before Kasserine. The two generals rarely met, and when they did, their conferences produced more confusion than clarity. Subordinates recalled utter confusion at being handed conflicting orders from different headquarters, not knowing which general to obey, Anderson or Fredendall.
When French forces of the 19th Corps requested support at Fade Pass in January before the main German attack, Fredendall disclaimed responsibility. The poorly equipped French were not his problem, he declared. He denied their requests for reinforcement. The French suffered 900 casualties in fighting that might have been avoided with American support. They were furious, and their trust in American leadership never fully recovered. When Eisenhower sent Major General Ernest Harmon to assess the situation during the crisis, Harmon arrived at Speedy Valley at 3 in the morning on February 22nd. The battle was at its height. German tanks were pushing through the pass. American units were falling back in disorder. Harmon found Fredendall groggy from lack of sleep. According to some accounts recorded in Patton's diary, Fredendall may have been drinking. Fredendall handed Harmon a note authorizing him to take charge of the forward elements and said simply, "The party is yours." Then he went to bed and slept for 24 hours while his corps fought for survival. The commanding general had abdicated his responsibility at the moment of greatest crisis. Harmon took charge and helped stabilize the front, but his opinion of Fredendall was fixed. His verdict to Eisenhower was blunt: no damn good. In his after-action report, Harmon called Fredendall both a moral and physical coward. He used even stronger language in private communications that have survived in various archives. The assessment was shared by virtually every officer who observed Fredendall during the battle. Eisenhower sent Major General Ernest Harmon to North Africa on February 24, 1943, officially as his eyes and ears, to investigate American performance. Bradley's real mission was assessing whether Fredendall should be relieved. It was a delicate situation. George Marshall had personally endorsed Fredendall. Eisenhower had cabled praise just months earlier. Admitting that the Second Corps commander had failed meant admitting that the entire chain of command had made a catastrophic error in judgment. Bradley inspected Second Corps thoroughly. He visited every division headquarters. He spoke with every senior commander. He walked the positions that had been overrun and examined the wreckage of American tanks. What he found confirmed his worst fears. When Bradley reported to Eisenhower at a command conference in Tebessa, Eisenhower asked what he thought of the command situation. Bradley replied directly, "It's pretty bad. I've talked to all the division commanders. To a man, they've lost confidence in Fred as the Corps commander." This was the verdict Eisenhower needed. If even Bradley, known for his cautious judgments and reluctance to criticize fellow officers, believed Fredendall had lost the confidence of his subordinates, then Fredendall had to go.
No commander can function when his division commanders do not trust him. British General Harold Alexander, commander of the newly created 18th Army Group that unified Allied forces in Tunisia, had already told American officers that he was sure they must have better men than that. The British had observed Fredendall's performance and found it wanting. Their confidence in American military leadership was shaken. Ernest Harmon was offered Second Corps command but declined on ethical grounds. He felt it would be improper to benefit from his negative assessment of Fredendall. The job should go to someone who had not been involved in evaluating the man he would replace. Mark Clark also turned down the command, preferring to wait for opportunities in the planned invasion of Italy. On March 5, 1943, Eisenhower personally flew to Tebessa to inform Fredendall of his relief. It was a difficult conversation. Fredendall had been Marshall's choice. He had commanded Second Corps since its activation. He had led the successful landing at Oran. Now he was being removed in disgrace, his career in ruins. Critically, Eisenhower couched the replacement in terms of a routine reassignment. He issued no formal reprimand. The official record would show that Fredendall had been transferred to other duties, not that he had been relieved for cause. This decision, made to spare Fredendall's dignity and avoid political complications at home, would have profound consequences for his future.
George Patton took command the following morning. He had been waiting impatiently in Morocco, commanding troops that had seen no action since the initial landings. He arrived at 2nd Corps headquarters on March 6th at 10 in the morning, finding Fredendall still at breakfast. The contrast between the two men could not have been more stark. Fredendall was rumpled and defensive. Patton was immaculate in riding breeches and polished cavalry boots, bristling with energy and impatience. The transition was complete within hours. Patton took one look at the demoralized headquarters and began issuing orders. His diary entries reveal his shock at what he inherited. On March 4th, even before taking command, he wrote that he was taking over rather a mess, but would make a go of it. On March 13th, after a week in command, he was more direct. "I cannot see what Fredendall did to justify his existence. Have never seen so little order or discipline." Patton's reforms were immediate and theatrical. He ordered the mess closed at 7:30 in the morning, requiring officers to rise early. No more leisurely breakfasts while soldiers prepared for combat. He demanded wearing of neckties by all officers at all times, even in the field. He required helmets to be strapped at all times, even in latrines. Soldiers caught without proper uniform faced fines of $25, which was half a month's pay for a private. Officers faced fines of $50. The troops called it the $25 derby. They grumbled about the regulations, the petty enforcement of standards that seemed to have nothing to do with fighting Germans. But Patton understood something that Fredendall never grasped. An army that maintains discipline in small things will maintain discipline when it matters. Bradley later observed the psychological impact of these seemingly minor requirements. Each time a soldier knotted his necktie, threaded his leggings, and buckled on his heavy steel helmet, he was forcibly reminded that the days before Kasserine had ended and that a tough new era had begun. The uniform requirements were not about uniforms, they were about mindset. Patton articulated his philosophy in his diary. "If men do not obey orders in small things, they are incapable of being led in battle. I will have discipline. To do otherwise is to commit murder." He meant it literally. Soldiers who did not follow orders instinctively, without thinking, would hesitate at critical moments and die. Their hesitation would kill the men beside them. Discipline was not about punishment, it was about survival. He also led from the front, a stark contrast to Fredendall's behavior. Patton visited every unit in 2nd Corps within his first week. He drove his jeep to positions under artillery fire. He stood in the open when German aircraft appeared overhead. His soldiers saw their commanding general sharing their dangers, and they responded. Within weeks, Patton had restored combat effectiveness to the demoralized corps. Officers who had hidden from responsibility emerged to lead their units. Soldiers who had fled in panic at Kasserine stood their ground under fire. The transformation was remarkable, but it was not miraculous. Patton had not changed the men, he had changed what they believed they could do. On March 23rd, 2nd Corps won its first victory against German forces at El Ghoutar. It was the first battle in which American forces defeated experienced German tank units in Tunisia. The same soldiers who had fled at Kasserine held their positions against repeated German attacks and threw them back with heavy losses. Eisenhower later wrote that morale in 2nd Corps was shaken and the troops had to be picked up quickly. For such a job, Patton had no superior in the Army. Lloyd Fredendall returned to the United States to a hero's welcome. The Army arranged for favorable press coverage. Journalists wrote stories about his service at Iran, his years of experience, his contributions to the war effort. There was no public acknowledgement of the disaster that had occurred under his command. The soldiers who had died at Kasserine were not mentioned. On April 25, 1943, Fredendall assumed command of the 2nd Army in Memphis, Tennessee. This was a training command responsible for preparing new divisions for combat overseas. He would never again lead troops in battle, but he would help train the soldiers who would fight in Europe and the Pacific. In June 1943, just 4 months after presiding over the worst defeat in American military history, Lloyd Fredendall was promoted to lieutenant general. The 3 stars on his shoulders was the reward for a career that had ended in catastrophe. He spent the rest of the war in Memphis, training troops and attending ceremonies. He retired in 1946 with full honors and a pension befitting his rank. He died on October 4, 1963, and was buried at Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery in San Diego. This outcome was not unique to Fredendall. The Army had established a pattern for handling failed commanders that emphasized rehabilitation over punishment. Orlando Ward, the 1st Armored Division commander, who had clashed with Fredendall over tactical doctrine and been proven right, was later relieved by Patton for unrelated reasons. But Ward subsequently commanded the Tank Destroyer School and Field Artillery School before taking command of the 20th Armored Division in September 1944, leading it to Europe the following year. Terry Allen, the aggressive commander of the 1st Infantry Division, who despised Fredendall, was relieved in Sicily in August 1943 for disciplinary problems unrelated to combat performance, but he returned to command the 104th Infantry Division in October of that year, leading it with brilliance and distinction through some of the hardest fighting in Europe. His soldiers called themselves the Timberwolves, and they followed Allen with a devotion that few commanders inspired. At least 5 generals relieved for cause during the Second World War later received another division to lead in combat. The pattern was consistent. Relief did not mean disgrace. Training commands served as soft landings for failed combat commanders. Second chances were available for those whose failures seemed correctable. The logic behind this policy was partly pragmatic. Officers with combat experience, even unsuccessful experience, could train replacements more effectively than those who had never faced the enemy. A general who had seen his plans collapse against German tactics could teach new officers what not to do. The knowledge gained from failure had value, even if the officer who gained it could not be trusted with another command. Additionally, Eisenhower's deliberate decision to avoid formal reprimand kept Fredendall eligible for promotion. The rationale was partly political. The controversy over Eisenhower's deal with Vichy Admiral Darlan was still generating criticism in newspapers and Congress. Another scandal, this time involving a general that George Marshall had personally endorsed, could damage both the war effort and the careers of those involved. As historian Thomas Ricks observed in his study of generalship, firing a commander that had previously been showered with praise had the potential of seriously damaging morale on the home front. Americans reading newspapers in February 1943 did not need to learn that their army had just suffered their worst defeat because its commanding general was hiding in a bunker 70 miles from the fighting. The contrast with German practice could not be more stark. Adolf Hitler executed 84 German generals during the war. According to military historians who have studied Wehrmacht personnel records, officers who failed in combat faced court-martial and often death. Officers who fell out of political favor faced worse.
The message from Berlin was clear. Failure meant death. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the very commander who defeated Fredendall at Kasserine, was forced to commit suicide on October 14, 1944. His crime was not military failure. He had been implicated, perhaps falsely, in the July 20th assassination plot against Hitler. Given the choice between public trial and the execution of his family, or quiet suicide and state funeral with his family left unmolested, Rommel chose the poison. The Desert Fox died by cyanide in his own automobile, wearing the uniform he had worn with distinction across 2 continents. Other generals met worse fates. General R. Erich Hoppner and General Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben were hanged with piano wire after the July plot, their executions filmed for Hitler's private viewing. Dozens of officers suspected of disloyalty were shot without trial. The German military operated in an atmosphere of terror that made honest reporting impossible and flexible response unthinkable. Joseph Stalin was even more extreme. During the Great Purge of 1937 and 1938, approximately 35,000 Soviet officers were arrested, executed, or dismissed from service. The senior ranks were devastated. Experienced commanders who had built the Red Army were shot as traitors on fabricated charges. The Red Army that faced the German invasion in June 1941 was led largely by officers promoted hastily to fill the gaps left by their executed predecessors. The consequences were catastrophic. Millions of Soviet soldiers died in the first months of the war, partly because their commanders lacked the experience and confidence to respond effectively to the German onslaught. The American system allowed redemption. The German and Soviet systems demanded perfection or death. The implications for military effectiveness were profound. American officers could take calculated risks, knowing that failure would not cost them their lives. They could report problems honestly without fearing execution for defeatism. They could learn from mistakes and apply those lessons to future operations. They could disagree with their superiors within limits without risking everything. The culture encouraged adaptation because adaptation requires acknowledging that something went wrong. German officers operated in terror of a single misstep. After the July 1944 assassination attempt, Hitler's paranoia intensified to the point of madness. Generals suspected of disloyalty were executed without trial. Even success was no guarantee of safety if it came at the cost of contradicting Hitler's orders. Field commanders who retreated to save their forces were shot for cowardice. Staff officers who reported unwelcome news were punished for defeatism. This created a culture of conformity at the worst possible time, when Germany desperately needed flexible responses to Allied offensives on multiple fronts. The information that reached Hitler was filtered through layers of officers who told him what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to know. Strength returns were falsified, supply shortages were minimized, strategic assessments were tailored to match Hitler's fantasies. Honest assessments that might have corrected German strategy were suppressed because speaking honestly was too dangerous. The result was catastrophic decision-making at the highest levels, a command structure disconnected from reality and unable to adapt. The soldiers who survived Kasserine bore witness to American forces at their lowest point. Their accounts, recorded in interviews and memoirs decades later, capture the chaos and terror of those February days. John Weston Miller, who served with the 9th Infantry Division and later retired as a colonel, recalled the scene vividly. The 1st Armored Division tried to stop them, he said, and there were over 100 tanks burning, American tanks. A whole regiment of American troops had surrendered. This was the first time we were really fighting. The Germans were just beating the hell out of us. He described the retreat in terms that still carried emotion years later. The jam of automobiles, ambulances, everything was such that we were fleeing from Kasserine Pass, really retreating. Men were carrying each other. All the ambulances were gone. This is a sight when you come up from where there was a war. The troops developed their own grim vocabulary for their equipment after experiencing its limitations against German weapons. Half-tracks became Purple Heart boxes because they offered so little protection against enemy fire. The 37mm anti-tank gun, useless against German armor with its shells bouncing off Panzer hulls, became the squirrel rifle. The black humor helped soldiers cope with equipment that seemed designed to get them killed.
War correspondent Ernie Pyle, who would become famous for his frontline reporting from North Africa to Okinawa, where he died, observed the American soldier with characteristic insight during those dark days. "As for our soldiers themselves," he wrote, "you need feel no shame nor concern about their ability. I have seen them in battle and afterwards, and there is nothing wrong with the common American soldier. His fighting spirit is good. His morale is okay. The deeper he gets into a fight, the more of a fighting man he becomes." The fault at Kasserine lay not with the men in the foxholes, but with the generals who put them there without proper support, coordination, or leadership. The Army's institutional response to Kasserine was swift and comprehensive. Field Manual 100-20, published on July 21, 1943, declared that land power and air power are co-equal and interdependent forces. Neither is an auxiliary of the other. Signed by General Marshall himself, this doctrine was based directly on lessons from North Africa, including the failures at Kasserine, where German aircraft had strafed American columns almost unopposed. Air superiority became mandatory before ground operations could begin. Basic combat training increased from 13 to 17 weeks. Soldiers would arrive in combat zones better prepared than the Green troops who had faced Rommel's veterans. Combined arms exercises replaced isolated branch training.
Infantry learned to work with armor. Armor learned to work with artillery. Everyone learned to coordinate with air support. Tactically, the penny packet dispersal that Fredendall had imposed on Ward's armor was explicitly prohibited. Large armored units would be kept masked for concentrated striking power. Tank destroyers shifted to defensive hull-down positions rather than offensive roles that exposed them to German guns that outranged their own. Artillery response times improved dramatically through better communications and forward observer procedures. Coordination between armor and infantry became a priority, enforced through joint exercises that punished units that failed to work together. The 18th Army Group under Alexander unified command of Allied forces in Tunisia, with liaison officers spread among different national units to prevent the confusion that had plagued operations under Fredendall. American, British, and French commanders learned to share information and coordinate plans. The coalition warfare that Fredendall had disdained became the foundation of Allied operations. Leaders were explicitly urged to command from the front, a direct repudiation of Fredendall's Speedy Valley approach. Generals who hid in bunkers would be relieved. Generals who led their men would be promoted. The message filtered down through every level of command. Even RML noticed the change. After later engagements against American forces, he observed that American commanders had come to understand and implement mobile warfare rapidly. British experience has been put to good use in American equipment, he noted, with professional respect. The Americans who had fled in panic at Kasserine were learning to fight, and they were learning fast. Historians have rendered consistent judgment on Lloyd Fredendall. Carlo D'Estaire, author of major biographies of Patton and Eisenhower, called him one of the most inept senior officers to hold a high command during World War II. Charles MacDonald, the Army's official historian for the European theater, described him as a man of bombast and bravado in speech and manner, who failed to live up to the image he tried to create. Stephen Ossad's detailed analysis in Army magazine cited 5 specific failures that doomed Fredendall's command. His inability to understand coalition warfare and work with British and French allies. His micromanagement that confused subordinates with incomprehensible orders. His physical absence from the front, where he could have assessed conditions firsthand. His tendency to blame others for his own mistakes. And his fundamental tactical errors in dispersing forces that should have been concentrated. Yet Rick Atkinson, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, An Army at Dawn, offers a more nuanced assessment. It was dead wrong to blame Fredendall exclusively for the disaster.
Colonel Robinet wrote that possibly one would have to search all history to find a more jumbled command structure than that of the Allies in this operation. The dysfunctional relationships between American, British, and French forces reflected failures that could be laid at Eisenhower's door as well as Fredendall's. 3 months after Kasserine, the war in North Africa was over. Over 275,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered when Axis forces collapsed in Tunisia on May 13, 1943. This was roughly 3 times the number of prisoners taken at Stalingrad, where 91,000 Germans had surrendered in February. The Americans who had fled in panic at Kasserine were among the victors at the final surrender. The handling of Fredendall was institutional damage control rather than criminal cover-up. Within Army circles, his failure was well documented. Harman's after-action report calling him a physical and moral coward remained in official files available to historians decades later. The officers who served under Fredendall knew exactly what had happened and why, but publicly the Army prioritized wartime morale over accountability. According to David Eisenhower, the general's grandson and biographer, his grandfather later repented of his weakness in sending Fredendall home without reduction in grade. The decision to avoid formal reprimand had allowed the hero's welcome and 3-star promotion that followed. It had spared Fredendall's dignity at the cost of justice for the soldiers who died under his command. The question that remains is whether the Army's approach was wise or merely convenient. Fredendall never should have commanded troops in combat. His failures were not the result of bad luck or impossible circumstances. They reflected fundamental deficiencies in leadership, judgment, and courage that should have been identified before he reached high command. The system that elevated him based on peacetime performance and staff college grades failed to assess whether he could function under fire. But the system that removed him and gave him a second chance to contribute through training may have extracted some value from his failure. The lessons of Kasserine were incorporated into training programs across the Army, ensuring that future divisions would not repeat the same mistakes. Within a year of Kasserine, those same divisions would be storming the beaches of Normandy. Within 2 years, they would be driving into the heart of Germany itself. The contrast with German rigidity helps explain why the Allies won the war. A system that executed generals for failure could not tolerate the kind of honest assessment necessary for institutional learning. The Wehrmacht remained tactically brilliant but strategically blind, unable to adapt because adaptation required admitting that something had gone wrong. The American approach, relief without disgrace, reassignment to training commands, second chances for some officers whose failures seemed correctable, created space for adaptation that the German system could not match. Lloyd Fredendall was a failure by any measure. His soldiers paid for his incompetence with their lives and their freedom. But the Army's handling of that failure reflected a flexibility that would prove more valuable than any individual victory. The soldiers who died under his command at Kasserine have no monuments bearing their general's name. They lie in military cemeteries in Tunisia and across the United States, their sacrifice a testament to the cost of incompetent leadership. But their deaths were not entirely in vain. The army that emerged from Kasserine was fundamentally different from the army that entered it. Doctrine changed, training improved, leaders learned to command from the front. The lessons written in blood at that narrow pass in the Tunisian mountains shaped the force that would liberate Europe. History offers no easy answers to the questions Kasserine raises. It offers only the record of what happened and the invitation to judge for ourselves. Lloyd Fredendall failed his soldiers. The army failed to hold him accountable. And somehow, out of that double failure, emerged the force that won the war. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans the globe. From veterans to history enthusiasts, you are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.